Approval voting is a voting system for multi-candidate races, races with more than 2 candidates, which are typical in, say, presidential primaries with 5 to 10 major candidates starting off in Iowa and New Hampshire. In those kinds of races, approval voting would permit you to vote for or approve of as many candidates as you like. So if there were 9 candidates in the race, the Democratic primary in New Hampshire in 2008, and you were a liberal Democrat and you could identify 3 people as liberal in the Democratic Party, then you wouldn't have to make an arbitrary choice of one of the liberals. You could vote for all 3 and thereby better express your preferences. So you can do everything you can under the present system. Vote for one candidate if you have a clear favorite. But if you don't have a clear favorite, if you're relatively indifferent among several candidates, like the Liberal Democrats, you can vote for all of those. Or if you despise somebody, you can vote for everybody else. So it gives you great flexibility in being able to express your preferences. And it's not a ranking system. Each person whom you approve of gets 1 vote, and the person with the most approval wins the election. And we've shown that it would have major consequences in a race like the 2000 presidential election. Presumably, many Nader supporters would have also voted for Gore to prevent their worst choice, Bush, from winning. So they would have cast 2 approval votes. Some would have bullet voted, we say, voted exclusively for Nader, and Gore would have, of course, his exclusive supporters. But it's quite clear that a sufficient number of Nader supporters would have also approved of Gore, such that he almost surely would have won the election in Florida and the presidential election. So it would have made, obviously, a difference in that election. And there are many other examples with significant third or fourth party candidates in which the outcome almost surely would have changed. We can't quite assert that it would change in the end, because when you change the rules, and we're changing the rules by allowing approval voting, the nature of the campaign would change, and we can't simply extrapolate from the present campaign. But I think there's good enough information in the 2000 election to say that under approval voting, Gore almost surely would have won. Besides giving the voter more flexible options, it tends to elect the strongest candidate overall, not the strongest minority candidate. And we have examples where significant candidates on the left or the right have beat out a centrist candidate. The centrist is hit from both sides, so to speak, by the left and right candidates in a 3-candidate race, and comes in third, let's say. So even if there's a runoff, which is sometimes proposed as a solution and used as a solution to try to find the strongest candidate, the runoff would pit the left candidate against the right, when it's pretty clear the centrist candidate in a pairwise contest against the left candidate would beat the left candidate, a pairwise contest against the right candidate would beat the right candidate, so it could beat each of his competitors in separate pairwise contests. We actually have a name for that candidate in these multi-candidate races. He's the Condorcet candidate, after the Marquis de Condorcet of late 18th century France, who proposed this kind of candidate and showed that one always doesn't find such a candidate. It almost surely would elect Condorcet candidates, winners, in these multi-candidate contests. So generally in the United States, the contest comes down to 2 major candidates in a general election, even an election like the 2000 election. But in party primaries, when you get 5 to 10 major candidates, it's often the case that the Condorcet winner gets cut out. The field is crowded, the centrists are squeezed, the strong left candidate or the strong right candidate wins. And it's a disaster, in my opinion, for the country. It happened in 1964 when the Republicans nominated Barry Goldwater, an extreme right-wing candidate, lost disastrously to Lyndon Johnson that year in the general election. It It happened to the Democrats in 1972. They nominated George McGovern, a kind of far-left candidate who lost massively to Richard Nixon that year. And that's not good for democracy because the election's essentially decided when one party nominates an extremist against the centrist of the other. And I think if approval voting were used, especially in primaries, it would tend to surface the strongest candidate in a party and make the contest much more competitive with two centrists running against each other rather than extremists who usually gets beaten in these kinds of contests. So I think not only does it help the individual, it helps the social choice, the candidate elected, making him or her a much more plausible candidate than a relative extremist like Goldwater in '64 or McGovern in '72. No, I actually think the opposite. I think when you can approve of more than one candidate, you're less likely to vote strategically. If you mean by strategic voting, ignoring, let's say, a first choice because he, a nader, is out of the running and voting for a second choice or a third choice to prevent your worst choice from winning, under approval voting, you can have your cake and eat it too. You can vote sincerely for the candidate who can't win, the nader, and you can cast a second approval vote, a strategic vote, for the candidate who can, Gore in the 2000 election. So I think it actually minimizes strategic voting. The two arguments that have been made against approval voting are, first, that it would tend to elect the lowest common denominator, the centrist candidate who tries to be everything to everybody. But I think the candidate who is the lowest common denominator is generally going to be unappealing to most voters. You try to be everything to everybody, you're not going to be acceptable to very many people. And a good example of a candidate who would win under approval voting would be Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan won in landslides in 1980 and 1984. He was a right-oriented candidate, but he was appealing to a substantial majority in each election. Nobody ever accused Reagan of being weak or pusillanimous. He had strong convictions, and he would have won not only under approval voting, but virtually any other system. So I think that's the kind of candidate who's generally appealing, maybe right of center or left of center, who's going to win. It's not always going to elect the candidate inoffensive, bland, who has nothing to say. So I think that's my argument, that it wouldn't have that effect. The other argument sometimes made against approval voting is that it would undermine the two-party system. Well, first of all, I think there's nothing sacrosanct about the two-party system in the United States. Most Western democracies have multi-party systems, and in my opinion, they're just as democratic, if not more so, than the United States. I would argue that if the two major parties, Republicans and Democrats, were so derelict as to nominate extremists in the same year, there should be room in the Senate for a centrist to come in and win, and approval voting would tend to promote that. Ross Perot is an example. In 1992, he was a significant third-party candidate who ran against Bush, the father, and Clinton that year, and he got 19% of the popular vote. Almost an all-time high for a third-party candidate. If there had been approval voting, he conceivably might have won because Democrats might also have approved of Perot. He was liberal on social issues, and so might conservatives. He was conservative on financial and economic issues. Now, he was also a little crazy, so that dispirited many of his supporters in the end. But a more credible centrist candidate, I think, should have that opportunity to win. And right now, our two-party system is pretty much impregnable under plurality voting. You have to vote for one or the other candidate. You're generally going to ignore the third or fourth party candidate. So that candidate has no chance. With approval voting, you can afford to vote for additional candidates. And if there's a sufficiently strong third or fourth party candidate, I think he or she should win.